I thought that was a great scene because as a character evolves, their belief system has to be assaulted. And it's not just the core belief, it's other things too. And I think there's a phrase I wrote in one of the chapters, what else was he missing? He's thinking about it. And that starts the unraveling of his belief system, that one chapter, that one scene.
This is Story to Count with Jen Jumba. In conversations with writers, something magical happens, and as readers, we begin to see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. And my hope is through these conversations, you will learn about their craft, them as a person, and you'll become like me, fiercely loyal once you read their current book, entire backlist, any future book, or any book they blurb. And when you see their name, you'll want to support them, not only as the incredible storytellers, but also the thoughtful individuals you have come to know. My guest today is Mark ONeill, whose debut novel, To Catch a Spy, is the estate-approved sequel to David Dodge's To Catch a Thief. To Catch a Thief was published in 1952 and was a commercial success. And a fun fact, one of the reasons it was so successful is that Alfred Hitchcock purchased the movie rights before it was even published. Now, to prepare for the conversation, I reread To Catch a Thief and was enthralled all over again with the story and see that it still holds up today. And to really make sure I had done my research, I had to rewatch the movie starring Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. Now, Mark says as a teenager, he became fascinated with To Catch a Thief, and particularly the character of John Robie. Seeing a character who was a circus acrobat turned jewel thief who also fought with the French resistance, John Robie could climb anything, break into any place, and was also independently wealthy living on the French Riviera. Not too shabby a life, right? Mark currently lives in South Carolina with his wife, continues to think about the adventures with John Robie and Francie Stevens. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Jen, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on here, so thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. I was rereading To Catch a Thief, David Dodge, and it's been reissued, part of a Library of Congress series of books. So there's a great preface to the book. And it talks about, which is ironic because this is how we met, that the eminent crime fiction critic Anthony Boucher developed with a high ingenuity and plotting and suspense with the clean, strong prose that is one of Dodge's standard virtues. And I just thought, how ironic. I'm reading this book. You and I had met at BoucherCon earlier this fall, and to see the very conference that it's named after, and for him to give a nod to David Dodge, and then for you to just turn around and pick up that story, a year later after we've met Francie and John Robie. Can you talk a little bit about your backgrounds and how you became wanting to essentially continue their adventures and pose a sequel?
So I've wanted to be an author my entire life. I mean, I'm going back to when I was before high school, but back then we didn't really have the resources to learn how to write that you have now. So I retired about 6 years ago. And I was, sitting at home thinking, what do I want to do? Because you have that thing where, you could do anything you want, but you got to figure it out. So I just remembered I always wanted to be a writer. And I was fascinated with John Robie. I mean, that guy was so intriguing. That character was so intriguing to me. So that's where I started. I thought, let me look into that and see if there's ever been a sequel. And there wasn't. So that started my journey.
That's a great journey. So this is estate approved. And I can tell you that having reread To Catch a Thief and then reading yours, the nuances that you picked up on John Robie's character, how he sits on the hearth, how he has a drink, just his mannerisms, how you absolutely capture them. Can you talk a little bit about how you went about getting their approval to do a sequel?
Sure. So that was actually a fascinating journey for me. So when I first retired, I said I wanted to be an author. So I went online, which we didn't have back, 40 years ago. So I went online and I got a bunch of resources on how to write fiction, how to write mysteries or thrillers. And I read that and I created my own master outline. And I just studied that. So, the time came for me to decide what to write about. And like I said, I'd always loved To Catch a Thief, that story, that even the film, Hitchcock film. And I thought, well, in the book, it was interesting, Jen. In the book, the John Robie character was a lot younger than Cary Grant. So the John Robie and Francie Stevens characters were much more of the same generation, say. So, reading that, I thought, my gosh, they had their whole lives ahead of them. And I just wondered what ever happened to them. And, it sort of bothered me. Like, when you are so enthralled with a character or characters or a story, you want to know what else is happening with that story. So I reached out at the time. There was a publisher out in Oregon. He was publishing To Catch a Thief, a small press. I reached out to him and asked him, has there ever been a sequel? Because, I did some research and I couldn't find anything on it. And he said he didn't think so, but he would put me in touch with a consultant who I think wrote the foreword for the current To Catch a Thief book, Randall Brandt.
Yes.
He's a librarian at the University of California, Berkeley. So I had to explain to this publisher, Jonathan, where I wanted to take the story. He said, okay, let me put you in touch with this consultant. This guy knows the estate of David Dodge. And he's kind of like a gatekeeper, right? So I got on the call with Randall, and he's got a great job, by the way. That guy, he's the curator for the California noir mystery writers, which, that includes like Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler.
Right.
Yeah, David Dodge. And he works for the University of California university system, right? So he's at Cal Berkeley. And so he put me in touch with Randall, and I had to pitch where I wanted to take the story. Randall liked it a lot. So he said, I'll set up a call with you in the estate. And I said, that's wonderful. Thank you. So he did. And I had to, talk to the estate, which is actually, I'm sure you know this, but copyrights, which protects a book, they're handed down like any other asset, right? So,
correct.
Yeah. So To Catch a Thief is now with David Dodge's granddaughter. She controls the rights. So her name is Kendall, but she's referred to as the estate, as in contract. So, so I got on a call with Kendall and her husband, John. They invited Curtis Brown onto the call. Now, Curtis Brown is one of the top literary agencies in the country. And in fact, they were David Dodge's original literary agents. So
this is so much fate. You were where you're supposed to be.
Yeah, it was crazy. So I get on the call. I did not expect that. But they were so Curtis Brown was very good. They were very welcoming to me, very warm. And they flat out said, look, good writers come from anywhere. You never know where they're going to come from. But it's a little bit of a risk for us. So why don't you write the first 30 pages of your book and we'll make a decision then. So I did. And it took me now, to be honest, I had been writing at risk. So I had it, but I had to keep refining it. And you probably know this too, but the first 30 pages of a book is by far the hardest part to write. I mean, you've got to establish the protagonist, the antagonist, the stakes. You've got to introduce the setting. And most importantly, you cannot lose the reader. Some people say the first chapter, some say the first paragraph, some say the first sentence. So I really reworked it all. And I finally sent it into them and they loved it. So
that's terrific.
Yeah, it really worked out for me. So in fact, Curtis Brown liked it so much they asked if they could represent me on these books. So I avoided that whole query letter process where, like as a debut author, I think your odds of getting a literary agent are like 1 in 6,000, something like that. I got to avoid all of that because they liked what I had written and it was tied to an established property. So that's kind of how it started. And like I said, I know how lucky I am. It was pretty good.
Oh, absolutely. You know how lucky you are. But also, I was reading a little bit about you to prep for this. Like as a kid, you sent away to learn how to get a lock picking set, right? As a
Yeah,
kid, a teen, you're doing pull ups because that's what John Robie does, right? So, like, you basically have been with that character forever. So, the fact that you were able to take what you intrinsically knew and translate that to a page or the first 30 pages, well done, you
thank you.
know?
And just so you know, I still do pull-ups almost every day. Like I think I did 6 yesterday. I'm getting older, so I can't do as many. And I was injured recently. And I have a lock pick set right on my desk where I still
Seriously?
practice. Yeah, like you can see that.
Oh,
Well,
yeah, you do.
yeah. And I mean, I practice it. I'm really not getting better at the lock picking, but I'm still okay at the pull-ups. So, but that's how enthralled I was with the John Robie
That's
character.
special, to be a teen. Like if you would ask your teen self now, do you ever think that you'll end up retiring and deciding, I've always wanted to be a writer, so why don't I just start with the sequel to Catch a Thief? And what your teenage self would say now. Pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. I have no. I think my teenage self would say what my youngest brother said when I published the book and he read it. He said, "I can't believe you wrote that."
Yeah, it
So,
is. It is certainly a gift, your storytelling, and to pick up the story, because these are two beloved characters in literature. They were two beloved characters on the big screen, and then to be able to pick up their story. So let's talk a little bit about To Catch a Spy.
okay.
Um, so you decided you want to continue their adventures.
Mhm.
How did you decide on what their next adventure would be?
So I do a lot of research and it's reflected in my newsletters, which I send out every month. I think I'm going to send one this afternoon
Okay.
for this month, but um, I I was thinking back, doing the research. The first book took place in the 50s, and I wanted to continue to stay in the 50s.
Hmm.
And that was a period in time where the Cold War was hitting its stride. So I thought, okay, that involved espionage. Then I thought about John Robie because these stories are really his stories. Over time, you'll see them become more Francie stories, but what's his skills as a cat burglar and a resistance fighter? Where could they be repurposed for maybe, especially the cat burglar skills, something that wasn't so self-centered?
Hmm.
And it just intersected with espionage. And I thought, okay. The other thing too was France at the time, they had a lot of colonies, which they gave, they gave almost all their colonies the choice of, do you want to stay with us, not as a colony, but as like an official department, I think they call it, which is like a state for us,
Hmm.
or do you want independence? And I mean, they had these departments in North Africa, in
Hmm.
the Caribbean,
Hmm.
the Polynesia. They had tremendous locations. And Hitchcock always said that his film To Catch a Thief had 3 stars: Cary Grant, Grace Kelly, and the French Riviera. So if you think about that, the location was very important. So that's kind of how I got into the espionage part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is great. The other part of the story, in To Catch a Spy, is Fashion Week, right?
Yes.
Set in the French Riviera. There's a big party to kick it off on Saturday, and then there's shows Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So
Yeah.
I guess my question to you is, what was your research like to kind of get all of that fashion sense and capture it? Because they had certain themes on certain days, and there was a nod to DuPont because Francie was wearing nylon for the first time that was able to stretch and didn't have any gaps for the bathing suit portion of the Fashion Week. So what was
So,
that research like?
so I'll be honest with you. I don't know anything about fashion. I mean, my ex-wife taught me about mules. I think they're shoes that have an open back or something.
Yeah,
I don't. Yeah. So that was
well
the
said.
extent. Yeah. And she used to say, like, I used to say to her, "Look, I don't know clothes," and she would get so angry at me. It's not clothes, it's fashion. But anyway, like I said, I do so much research and right down to the fabric. Like, I know I don't know fashion, So I did a ton of research, what clothes women wore, what was introduced, what fabrics were introduced. And
Mm-hmm.
I even put in the book something about this guy, Louis Rayard, who invented the bikini. And,
Yeah.
that was one of the most controversial, it may have been the most controversial fashion element in the history of fashion. And some of his quotes were just fascinating to me. So I worked all of that into the story.
Yeah, one of the things I admire about you all as writers, I mean, many things, but one of the things is your ability to do the research and translate it into a book and make it part of the story that doesn't feel like I'm reading a history book, right? Or a nonfiction book. I mean, it is so skillfully woven into the story and the action and the scenes and the characters and what they're doing and wearing and feeling. So it was so well done. To say you didn't know fashion, I never would have known. I was like, oh, there's this other side of Mark I don't know. He loves fashion.
Well, the other part of that, Jen, was I had to then imagine what Fashion Week at the Riviera would have been. And, it's such a resort type area. It would have probably involved bathing suits at some point. It
Mm-hmm.
would, most likely people go out in the evenings. They go to, out to dinner, to casinos and all that. So evening wear would have been a part of it. So and casual wear, but, for a resort type area. So I had to imagine all of that. And I remember when I was researching like casual wear, I came across like capri pants.
Yes,
Like,
that was one of my favorite things.
Yeah, they were just coming out. And, so I start researching that. And Grace Kelly, who played Francie Stevens, she was big on capri pants. But, I came across this nugget of gold that Mary Tyler Moore, the actress, was one of the people that really established capri pants. And I had no idea. Yeah. And so I'm reading about this, and I put it in one of my newsletters, which you can find on my website. But I guess she was playing Laura Petrie in the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Okay.
And she
Right.
was debating with the producers, who were all men, like, women don't wear house dresses. They wear
No.
pants.
Right.
Right. Back then.
Right.
And so, but they kept putting her in dresses. And she said, look, just give me, she kept fighting to wear pants. And they said, okay, they, landed on capri pants, but only for 3 episodes. And she said, okay, but we'll see how it goes. And it was so successful that she stood up to them and said, I'm not putting a house dress back on. So you could fire me, or this is how we're going. This is the direction we're going in.
And that's what people want, right? So,
Yeah. But
being
think
in tune
about
to
the
your
courage
audience. Yeah.
for her. Like, she had to stand up to a male-dominated industry,
Right.
dictating what a woman was wearing. And she stood up to them and said, nope, you don't know what you're talking about. I do. And this is what I'm doing.
Makes me like her even more,
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, I always think like capris were for people who are taller. I'm vertically challenged, so like I put on capris and they're almost like crop pants. So
My wife too. I think she's 5'1".
yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. So let's talk about a little bit about Francie and John. This dynamic, they were together and he finds himself a year later and Francie's no longer part of his life. And he realizes she's going to be at Fashion Week because she is tapped by a lead designer to be a model during Fashion Week. They bump into each other. I say bump because John Robie is always observant and knows where people are and finds a way to connect to the people he needs to connect with. But one of the things that Francie talks to him about is the fact that he's selfish. She mentioned it a little bit earlier. And he's trying to understand why she sees him as selfish. And he comments on the fact that, she comes from wealth and has family, whereas he basically was orphaned and has always had to rely on himself and the skills that he had in order to make a living. So can you talk a little bit about that dynamic between the two of them?
Sure. So I first of all, what you've just touched on, the selfishness, right? That, like, to me, there's uppercase flaws or character arcs. Like you might have a platoon leader whose entire group of soldiers was his or her group of soldiers were killed because of a mistake that person made. They then have to atone for that. that's uppercase. But
Mm-hmm.
lowercase to me is like being selfish or being not having enough confidence in yourself, or, being biased, things like that, that a lot of people can relate to. I certainly can relate to being selfish, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's something I had been told most of my adult life. But and what I found, like so there's three things that make for great writing, I think: plot, character arc, and theme. So the theme
Mm-hmm.
of my book is the value of selflessness. You want
Yes.
to see the character go from being selfish to selfless. Um, that's the character arc. The plot is the espionage plot in Fashion Week and Francie's return. So the thing that I like, though, was I find with my flaws, I tend to rationalize them at
Mm-hmm.
first. I don't immediately, I defend them, I rationalize them, but it's only after I hear something a few times that I'm like, whoa, I got to start paying attention to this. Somebody's onto something. So I wanted
Right.
John to do the same thing, like to kind of defend himself to himself, rationalize his behavior. And I thought that was a great way to rationalize it. Like, in that chapter that you're talking about, he actually tells himself that they had never had to deal with what I've had to deal with. Her, his friend
Right.
Paul, they've always been privileged. And I
Right.
haven't been. I've been orphaned. I've had to look out for myself. So that's what they see as selfishness. I see as just survival.
Yeah. Or
And
grit. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And it's not until much later that he realizes he's rationalizing.
Well, but I mean, so you have him rationalizing being selfish because of how he grew up in his life experience. But at the same time, he has a code that you talk about in this book in terms of being a jewel thief, and the fact that he's only stealing from people who are wealthy, whose insurance will cover it and are likely able to buy something again. But his code to justify why he's stealing jewels is he won't use weapons, he
Yeah,
won't hurt anyone, and he doesn't damage property. It almost
right.
sounds like a modern day game show we would have, that this is your challenge you have to do, and you can't use a weapon, you can't damage property, and you can't hurt anyone. And
Right.
that's kind of the code he lives by until he meets Marcel's wife. And
Yes. Okay.
she basically says to him, like, hey, we've met before, you've stolen from me. And he's like, no, I don't think so, and she's like, no, yes, you have. And he's like, oh, well, it's covered by insurance and you can afford to get new. And that's when she says to him about the sentimental value of a ring that had been passed down from generations and the only thing her family basically escaped with. And I think it's at that point where he's starting to understand. So you talked about having to hear something a couple times.
Yes.
And I think that's one of those moments where now he's really thinking about his actions and how it, led to his, breakup with Francie at that point,
Yes. Yeah. That's really astute. I think, and those things are related. Like, if you think about it, his selfishness is invisible to him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on a belief system that he had to be gritty and whatever to survive. Another belief in his flawed belief system is that there were no real victims of his
Mm-hmm.
crimes. But as Odette points out to him, you're not thinking about the sentimental value of a piece you might have stolen. Forget the monetary value, which he's thinking about because he's a thief. She's talking
Mm-hmm.
about, the sentimental value and what that meant to her, or could have meant to her. And I thought that was a great scene, because as a character evolves, their belief system has to be assaulted. And it's not just the core belief, it's other things too. And I think there's a phrase I wrote in one of the chapters, what else was he missing? He's thinking
Mm-hmm.
about it. And that starts the unraveling of his belief system, that one chapter, that one scene.
Absolutely. I think that's the thing that's interesting is he's so astute in so many other ways. In order to have where he says he's retired but not reformed, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So he still knows what to do. So he's so astute in reading where people are in a room, where the possible escapes are, where the shadows are. You capture this beautifully as he's going, scaling drain pipes and knowing where to hide in the shadows where people's eyes most tend to go and not causing movement. And yet something that's right smack in front of him, he lacks that same astuteness.
Yes.
To recognize.
Yeah, I think but again, I try to write characters character growth as I have grown. And
Okay.
I find like in some areas I'm good, I'm bright at things. In other areas, I mean, it's a big mystery to me, and people point out, well, you're not really processing this well, or you're a little selfish, or, you need a little more confidence.
Oh my goodness, Mark, you're human.
You're right.
Breaking news. Mark ONeill is human.
Very much so. I mean, more than you realize, In fact, like one of my beta readers is my daughter, Alicia. And she said, the first draft of To Catch a Spy, she was reading it and she's like, oh, no. You got to look out for these sensitivities. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Like there's this one character, Vittoria, right, who I created. And I have John's friend say, how's her cooking? And my daughter's like all over that. Like, no. You don't ask about that, about a woman. Like, and I said, yeah, but I'm writing about the 50s. There were a lot of biases back then. And she said, yeah, but your readers live today. So, you have to factor that in. And there was a couple of others like 3 that she flagged for me. And I was like, oh my gosh, these are brilliant. And, so again, invisible to me, putting myself in that 50s mindset, I found myself back there and I had to be pulled back into reality a little bit.
What a great beta reader. So, kudos to Alicia for not just does it take place in the 50s, but people are reading it today. I think trying to make sure that you're still true to that time period, but at the same time to how we've evolved as human beings today in terms of sensitivities. But that character you created, Vittoria, what a great character. Oh, what a terrific character. And then her bunch of brothers. Can you talk about where the idea came to create her? Because she's fantastic.
So there's a little story about that. So when a publisher licenses your property to bring it to market, like happened to me, they send you an editorial letter. That's really your first big touch point with the publisher. Okay. And in that letter, they tell you what they loved about the story and what you need to work on. The number one thing they loved was this character, Vittoria. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool. So I emailed the editor back and I said, I'm so glad that you like Vittoria. Now, she is a very attractive, muscular Italian woman who's a bit of a hothead. She's sexy, but she's very dangerous. So I said, I'm so glad you like her because, I've been around strong women my whole life. For example, my wife, Victoria, who is Italian, muscular, very attractive, a little bit of a hothead, sexy, and dangerous. And she wrote back, oh, please tell me it's, based on your wife. I said, well, I have to read the disclaimer, like no characters are based on anyone living or dead. Right. But, so really the inspiration came from
influenced.
Yeah, it came from my wife, the inspiration, to be honest. And that is exactly, what my wife is like. So in fact, I thought this was fantastic. My wife, we live in a community in South Carolina, and my wife was out walking one day and, because it's like a 4-mile loop that we can do. And she's out walking and a friend of hers pulls her car over and says, how does your husband know women so well? How do you think? And my wife said, it's fiction.
That's terrific.
Only, someone like Victoria or Vittoria could say that and get away with it.
Absolutely. So the other thing, there's a couple lines in your book that strike me, which I think, you talk about characters, making them believable, relatable, which is why I think we gravitate towards books like To Catch a Spy, because we find ourselves, while we might not be jewel thieves or retired circus, acrobats, we understand what it's like to put ourselves in situations, to risk things, to the things we do for, the end, and does it justify the means? Maybe not. Francie is talking to John and her mom is, really wants Francie to be with John, thinks John's like the greatest thing ever. And Francie's like, no, it's not just one big thing. It's these little incremental things, and I'm just done with them. And her mom says to her, well, people can change. Francie's like, absolutely not. People can change. So the question is, do you think people can change? And if they can, what makes them change? What motivates them to change?
So I have to caveat this answer. I do think people can change. I know at myself, I have changed dramatically over the course of my life. A lot of people cannot change. They're just so stuck in their ways. And I think what makes you want to change is it's almost like a mirror is held up to you. And in that mirror, there's a bastion of integrity or a betterment. And you aspire to that. And that's how you want to be. Like, you have to start with a baseline of, I am not perfect, but I want to be better. And even better is it's never going to be perfect. But I think there's a lot of people who say, you know what, I'm pretty good as I am. I don't need to hear anything. I don't need to see anything. And, what you see is what you get. But I never agreed with that principle. I've always felt that life is a continuous process of trying to improve yourself, always.
Right.
So.
The other line that really struck me is, we all tell ourselves things to justify our actions. We do that enough, we believe them, and then we can't see the truth, just the story we've created. And it's a dangerous way to go through life, not being able to see the truth.
Totally. Yeah, I love that line. I remember that. I believe Odette says that to John when she's telling him about his, the sentimental value of a piece he stole. And that, to me, I wrote that because it spoke to me personally, like the invisibility of a flaw, especially a lowercase flaw, like a smaller one. You don't often see it right away. And I often equated, Jen, with feedback on my book. Like, if I get feedback on something, I'll log it. If 2 people now tell me it, you've got my attention. If 3 people tell me the same thing, I got to make a change. And it's no different with your personal traits, your, who you are as a person, your character almost. If people start telling you things, you got to listen. You have to listen. And if you hear it from a couple people, you have to change. And that's what that quote kind of captured for me, was that John was rationalizing his behavior so much that he had lost sight of what was real. And I wanted that, again, that assault on his belief system. That was really the first salvo at that really got his attention.
And I think it speaks to, an incident. We're quick to, forgive, forget. It's when we start to see a pattern of things. So it speaks to your, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Okay, wait a second. This has my attention. And it does the same for you if you notice something with somebody else. Like, oh, that's a pattern. They're always late to something, right? That's a pattern. It's not just, oh my God, I hit traffic or whatever.
Right.
So I always think that's interesting and how it impacts the dynamics between people. And I think Francie is kind of weaving her own narrative about John. Her mom, who's a terrific character too, Maud, is kind of weaving a narrative about John. And then John has his own, thinking he should be with Francie. Francie's now taken up with Alex.
Yeah. They often say, like, in a divorce, like, there's the one partner story, the other partner story, and then the truth, right? So there are multiple views on engagements, on dynamics.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I also think it's interesting when you think about those dynamics, the difference between an excuse and an explanation.
Yeah.
Some things was, well, the reason why I'm late is because this outside incident happened that I had no control over, versus, well, that's just kind of how I am. And I don't really value your time, so I'm always going to be late or run on my own time.
That's how I look at it too. Like, that's a big problem. And if I always look at it as if people don't respect your time or whatever it is about you, they're not going to be on time, right? They look at their time as more valuable than your time, maybe, and then they rationalize it so many different ways. And it's the same with selfishness, I think.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to admit that they've been selfish or they are selfish,
Right.
but then when you start thinking about it, you're like, wow, that's why, like, context is okay. But if I find that if I've been at fault, I
Mm-hmm.
try to not give the context, because at the end of the day, it's still a bit of rationalization. I'd rather just give the apology, like, look, I'm sorry, and going forward, I'm not going to try to do this again. Hopefully that's enough for you. I could explain it a million different ways, but why? At
Right.
the end of the day, how did it impact the other person?
Right. And I think that's what John is trying to come to in this story. You have the arc, of the spy and the espionage going on between Russians and set during this, fantastic fashion week in the French Riviera. And at the same time, you have the arc of John and Francie, and him trying to, want to apologize, but Francie making sure he knows what he's apologizing for. And if he,
Yes.
that's a great thing about this story, and stories in general, is there's so many different layers. I mean, you have this incredible setting of the French Riviera, and who wouldn't want to go there? And did you happen to go there to do research? Because
No, I did not. I've
you
gotten
should
to
have.
know, I know, I really should go. But I've gotten to know this author, Brian Freeman. He writes all of the Jason Bourne books now. And he
Mhm.
also writes standalones. He's got a book, Photograph, that just came out. And
Okay.
he was explaining to me, like, you don't really, you could do a lot of research on your own. You don't have to leave wherever you are. But then there's other authors like Brad Taylor, who lives up in Charleston, and
Yeah.
he's on a research trip right now. Mark Greaney does research trips.
Hmm.
Simon Gervais seems like he does. So, there's mixed opinions on it. But what I'm finding, I mean, when I worked for Pfizer, I traveled a ton. And there was a year where I was in international marketing. So I think I traveled 160,000 miles in that year.
One
Um,
year.
in one year. I mean, I was all over the world, and I grew to dislike travel. And luckily, my wife, Victoria, she doesn't really appreciate travel either. And now it's just gotten so challenging to do. So, I don't, I'd love to travel, I think, a little bit to see the Riviera. Or my second book takes place on the island of Martinique. I'd like to go there. But this is working so far. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna
So
keep
so
doing
far so good. And as a reader, I would say it's nice to be able to travel without having to leave, to feel like, you talk about Francie being on the beach and the sound of the ocean and the waves and the wind and the sand, and just capturing what it feels like, even just walking on the sand, how it's uneven. And her tailor comes, and of course he's like all dressed in a suit and a coat, like on a beach, like he can't be very comfortable.
Right.
um
And I grew up on the Jersey Shore, so I know the smell of a boardwalk. I mean,
yeah.
that is such a memorable, um, positive thought invoking smell. And the other thing I remembered is, I can remember, like, I used to be a lifeguard, so I'd be walking behind a group of people and I could smell like their suntan lotion or their
Yeah.
skin cream. I could smell it. Like, that's how
Yeah.
prevalent
Smells
that
like
smell
summer.
was.
When you smell that copper tone, smells like summer.
Yes. And so I put something in my book about a smell, about a cream that was used at the Riviera at that time, a skin cream. And I just thought, let me use my own experience to do that.
Kind of capture all the senses. And the French Riviera truly becomes another character in this book. And that sense of place, that we're right there on the beach watching the models on the boardwalk, and then flipping when they're coming from the beach. And you gotta love Francie. She kind of just takes her own thing and runs with it. I mean, she's told exactly what she's supposed to do and how she's supposed to walk and what she's supposed to wear. And she just has this little bit of sass, for lack of a better word, to kind of put her own spin on it.
Yes.
And it's delightful.
I love that about that character, Francie. I love that about her. I mean, yeah, she understands the fundamentals of how to be a model, and in fact, I think I wrote that like she's like a socialite in the stories, right? The original story and my story, and I have her being friends with a real model in real life from New York who taught her how to
Yeah.
walk and all of that. But she does have that independent streak, and you see it in the first book, the film. You see it everywhere. So I
Mhm.
wanted to keep that, and also, thinking back to those times, like it just seemed like not a lot of women had the courage to do things like that. And so you'll
Yes.
see in the second book, I think the two characters that, in my opinion, that really take on a higher role are Mother and Francie. Like you
Ooh.
see them start to step into that
Yeah.
a level of confidence that they, I think Mother always had the confidence, and that's why
Hmm.
she and John get along so well. But Francie she needs to grow into that. Francie starts from a place um, of suboptimal confidence. I'll say that. And
Right.
she needs to grow into she needs to realize like these little moments, like where she adds her own twist, those build her confidence. And
Hmm.
you'll see in the second book that it really starts to, take on a life of its own. And she starts to become a believer in herself, which I think is very important, especially considering, the time frame of the 50s when I don't think a lot of women had the not just the ability but the opportunity to believe in themselves.
Yeah, seeing women with a sense of agency is
Yeah,
such a great thing, and to be able to capture that, and not just, nope, that's who she is, but to see that development, that character arc, is fantastic. And speaking of character arcs, in John's, his friends like Coco and Luca, who come to his aid, and we're friends. You ask a friend to do something, we just show up. And there's the phrase that you use a couple times throughout the book about honor among thieves. Can you talk a little bit
yes,
about John and his friendships?
yeah. So I mean that's an important principle, I think, for everybody. How good a friend is a friend, and I also believe in not just the main character arc but sub character arcs. Like there has to be growth in some sub characters, and I
Hmm.
think what I loved about John's engagements or interactions with Coco
Hmm.
is he doesn't really understand why Coco is saying um, a friend is a friend. Like I was a friend to you when you needed me. Now I need you, and you're saying no. John has a valid reason to say no, but he's got to dig a little deeper to find out exactly what is driving Coco to do that. John does, and then like a good friend, he solves that problem with, helps Coco.
Yes.
And Luca's a little different. Luca is kind of um, he's a character I created, and he's a simpler character. He thinks
Hmm.
more simply than other characters. Not a lot. And I guess this is typical of some guys. Like there's not a lot of depth to the thinking. So, but he'll do what John needs, but
Hmm.
he doesn't ask for anything in return. And those seem to me like the best friends.
Yes.
When there's it doesn't have to be a two-way street. It's what do you need, and I'll help you with that.
Right. Because it will be reciprocated when that other person needs something.
Right, and but the mindset I think has to be like no, there you don't have to think about the reciprocation. You're just thinking about giving,
Yeah.
which is something I learned from a friend of mine, Jim. Guy's a CEO now. He's a former Marine. And I remember we were talking once, I think it was about marriages. And I was just talking about frustrations. And he said, hey, stop thinking about what you're getting and think about what you're giving. And
Wow.
and full stop. And I was blown away by that. Like, wow, that means a lot in every aspect of life.
Oh, without a doubt. That's great advice.
Yeah.
Fantastic advice.
It
I
stuck
heard
with
you
me my
mention,
whole,
yeah.
go ahead.
I heard you mention it a couple times. You said books. You said in the next book it's being set in Martinique. So Francie and John will continue. Yes?
Yes, yep.
Okay.
And you'll see a lot of the same characters, like Mother,
Yep.
Lapique. You'll see him.
Oh, yeah.
I love that character too. He's from the original book, as his
Yes.
mother, Paul, and you'll meet Danielle, who
Okay.
was in the first
First
story.
book. Okay.
Yeah, the first book, and the film, and they were different. But yeah, you'll see a
Yeah,
subset
because
of
she's
that
married to
original book.
Paul, which I think is really kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
I think very interesting, and I think, but you'll see different characters, kind of like I think at the end of my book, Lepic, the Inspector Lepic, he grows
yes.
and he starts to, because he now understands the
Hmm.
others, like John, who he's bitter about, but he sees themselves. I think Lepic has an awareness that John sees them as peers. Whereas Lepic, as the police detective, he always looked down at John as a criminal, but he got to
Hmm.
see a different side of John in my book. And so now,
Absolutely.
right? So, but I'm loving that second book. The working title is To Catch a Traitor, but who
Okay.
knows what it's going to be?
Okay. Very cool. I was just thinking, because that was one of the questions, like this should be a series. Well, glad to know that it's going to continue. But what they would catch next. So
I'm going to
that's,
run out of To Catch a
oh
whatever.
no, we'll come up with lots of things. Don't worry.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, so it's hard to believe we're nearing the end of the conversation. And before we get to the final 5 questions, is there anything that I haven't asked that you want readers to know,
Oh, wow, that's a good
other than to
question.
go out and buy the book and read the book?
Oh, I think if it's for you, get the book, read it. I think you'll love it. If what we've been talking about is appealing. Um, I think the big message for me is like a big message I would like people to understand is you can do anything at any time. It's not easy, but if you really want to do it, you can do it. So I wasn't a writer, but I am a writer now. And, it took me a year of studying full time to really get from, being a non-writer to someone who could write something, and, a good editor to make it better. But that I would say that's what I would like people to know. Like, I'm, I'm older, but you're never too old to really jump into something new,
Wow,
whatever it is for you.
such sage wisdom. So here we are, story's end, final 5 questions. In
Okay.
one of the opening scenes of To Catch a Spy, Francie's driving a car. You're describing it, exterior that's blue like her eyes, and an interior that's intense red like her heart. What kind of car would you drive that reflects who you are?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think so. 2 years ago, I almost bought a BMW Z4 convertible because I've always loved convertibles, and I test drove it twice, and I thought, you know what, this isn't for me, even at the great price the guy was selling it for, and it had like less than 5,000 miles on it, and I said,
And
nope.
you live in South Carolina, where it's a lot more, you could get a lot more use out of the convertible than I in Cleveland,
Yeah,
Ohio.
yeah. But then I realized I'm a practical person. I have a Hyundai now.
Yeah.
My wife and I share a car, and I think if I had a car, it would be a practical car,
Okay.
and I would say a durable car.
Okay. Very cool. Francie's staying in a hotel in the French Riviera that in the book is the former home of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Whose house would you want to stay in?
Wow. So I got to be honest with you. If I didn't write the sequel to Catch a Thief, it might have been a sequel to North by Northwest. That's how much I love Cary Grant. So I'm going to say Cary Grant's house, wherever that was.
Perfect. Okay, John's signature drink in the book is an Aperol Spritz.
Yes.
Do you have a signature drink?
So I don't drink. I had to give up drinking back in 1999, right before the turn of the century. And, I'm half Irish, half Italian, so I think the half Irish speaks to that. But
Yeah.
I did make Aperol spritzes for my family, and I put that in one of the newsletters. I think I wrote about sable cookies or biscuits.
Yes.
And made
Yeah,
those.
but they have to be dunked in milk. So immediately I'm like researching, where can I get these? Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at my newsletters, there's a recipe, and I also made canelés, the little turret-shaped pastries, because those are in the book. Again, research I did. Those were big back then. But I don't. If you were to ask me what my signature drink is right now, I would say LaCroix coconut flavor.
Ooh, I'm a LaCroix key lime person, but
favorite pie.
Yeah, mine too. So long as you score it with the fork beforehand and then squeeze. Yep. Apparently, I learned that when I traveled not too long ago, that there's a proper key lime pie technique, etiquette, so to speak.
Oh, I did not know that. I'm gonna try. And you squeeze key lime or lime
with your fork, and then squeeze the lime. Then that lime juice further embeds in the slice of pie.
Oh, I'm going to try that. Maybe
Feel it
tonight.
right here. Okay, so John's mom says everyone has something to teach you. What's the best lesson you have learned since publishing this book?
So I totally agree with that. I think people from every walk of life can teach you something. And that's why I have his mother saying that. The thing I learned is about you really need to promote yourself. The publisher does a great job of it, but at some point they stop doing it. And they tell you up front, but you really have to be out there. And that's something I.S. Berry, she wrote The Peacock and the Sparrow.
Yes.
She was really preaching that to me. And Nick Petrie, the author of the Peter Ash series, he was telling me that too. Like, don't short it. Like, and whatever you think it is, it's so much more. And it is.
Yeah. And as readers, I will say that I appreciate it. So you've mentioned your newsletter. Where can, for people listening to want to sign up to your newsletter, is there a website they should go to? Yeah,
it's www.tocatchathief, that's all one word, all lowercase.com. So www.tocatchathief.com. And if you go there, there's a newsletter tab right up at the top. You just click on that. And I must have 18, 20 newsletters out. I started writing them over a year ago.
That's terrific. It gives you this extra glimpse into you as a writer, to your book, to the characters in the book, that what we read, that how much depth there is beyond just the 330 so pages. And then the final question, what song is always on your road trip playlist?
Oh, so I have a brother who's in the music industry. He's got a good job, works with BMI, and Sitting at the Dock of the Bay is the song that we kick around a lot, he and I. And so I'm going to go with that one. Now, having said that, there's others I love, like Imagine Dragons. There's a song I love of theirs. There's some older songs, but that's the one that came to mind right away when you asked me that.
Wow, great tune, and one that deserves to be sung at the top of our lungs for sure.
Yeah.
I want to say a huge thank you, Mark ONeill, for joining me today. To all of you listening, for more information, visit tocatchathief.com. Sign up for the newsletters. You will not be disappointed. And then to find out who else is going to be a guest on Story to Count, go to storytocount.com. I'm Jen Jumba. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen. It's been wonderful.